this could be one of the biggest finds for Christianity since the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Hey everybody, this is not one of the biggest finds for Christianity. This is just a fraud that we've known about since early 2011. The Jordan codices were not discovered by archaeologists, but by a con artist named David Elkington, who contacted a classics professor at Oxford in 2010 with some photos of one of these codices, and that professor showed that the script on it was actually lifted from a tombstone that was on display in Amman, Jordan, by someone who did not understand the writing, confused some of the letters, and had copied it in the middle of some of the words, so it was just gibberish. Elkington obviously did not release that information, or that codex that the classics professor had showed was a fraud, because he's a con artist. So unfortunately, these are not real, and these mean nothing to the early history of Christianity.
Like letter for letter, not word for word, letter for letter, the same as it is today.
Hey everybody, it's simply not true that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve a Bible that is letter for letter, the same as it is today. The majority of verses actually have differences in them. Now these are tiny differences, sometimes as simple as spelling that don't change meaning at all, but there are still thousands of places where there are meaning changes, and some of these are significant. For instance, Deuteronomy 32:8 ends, and God set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Deuteronomy J, shows a different reading. God set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And it continues, and Adonai's portion is his people. His allotted share is Israel. A lot of scholars believe this demonstrates a very early distinction between Elyon and Adonai as one of the sons of God. Hey everybody, my name is Dan McClellan, and I am new to TikTok. I have been lurking for a while and enjoying all kinds of content that is educational, that's entertaining, that's uplifting, but one thing I've also been seeing is a lot of misinformation and a lot of rhetoric about my area of expertise, namely religion and the Bible. I have degrees in ancient Near Eastern studies, in Jewish studies, in biblical studies, and in theology and religion. Most of the content I see related to religion and the Bible is either apologetic or antagonistic, which means it's generally aimed at boundary maintenance of some kind or another. I'd like to offer something different and provide accurate information that's more about making sure the public has access to the data and the resources they need to be able to engage with everything that's out there. So let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I will see you around.
It's literally missing verse 21.
So this is actually pretty fascinating. There are 16 passages in the New Testament that are generally omitted from contemporary Bible translations, even though they maintain the traditional versification. And this is because most traditional Bible translations, like the KJV, are based on source texts that we refer to as the Textus Receptus, that were collated from a small number of rather late Greek New Testament manuscripts. And the tradition they're based on is characterized by harmonizations, some expansions, as well as increased praise and doxologies. This isn't anything nefarious. This is people just trying to increase praise for God. But in the 19th century, we started discovering more earlier and more reliable Greek New Testament manuscripts. And so modern translations use those as the source text, omit the verses we know were later, and maintain the versification. So nothing nefarious, but definitely fascinating history.
Can you please explain to me, with all the information available, how people still believe in religion?
Sure thing. Our modern concept of religion is focused primarily, but not unilaterally, on deities, and the short explanation of that is that evolution and the shared features of the human experience have endowed our minds with high degree of sensitivity to the agency in the world around us, and the notion of some highly powerful agents directing affairs behind the scenes comes quite naturally to people who lean more into their intuitive reasoning than into their analytical reasoning. Also, our minds don't automatically recalibrate when loved ones die, and so they still want to project the sense of their presence, and so things that cue us to that presence will continue to do so, which leads to belief in an afterlife. And basically, as long as there are human beings with brains, there will be belief in deities, belief in afterlife, and there will be groups that engage in practices related to those beliefs that create social cohesion and give them a sense of meaning and fulfillment.
This is a yod. This is a yod. Those are different Hebrew letters. And this is a vav.
None of that is true. The Hebrew aleph is based on an ox's head that's become stylized over the centuries. Take a Latin A, turn it upside down, you got the face, you got the horns. There you go. Hey everybody, today I'd like to briefly talk about the concept of religion. In the ancient world, the Latin term for religion actually referred to the duties that we owed to other members of society, including deities. In the Middle Ages, it referred to ecclesiastical orders, so one church could have multiple religions. In the Renaissance, that's when we began to interiorize and universalize it, because we were engaging with Islam, which had far different practices, but we wanted to subsume everything within kind of a humanistic framework, and so it became about an impulse to deity. And then during the Reformation, there was a big power struggle, and we created this division of religion from politics. So the way we talk about religion today is really an invention of the Reformation and would have been totally alien to the ancient world. Hi everybody, I want to talk about something that is broader than religion, but definitely is an issue within religion, and that's the use of definitions. To define something is generally to reduce it to the shortest list of necessary and sufficient features, but that framework can be fundamentally distorting, and particularly when imposed upon conceptual categories that were not formed, are not learned, and are not used with any reference to such features. And I'll give you a good example. That's the word furniture. You probably know what furniture is. You can probably distinguish furniture from not furniture, but you also probably never had to look it up to learn the term. You don't know what the necessary and sufficient features of furniture are, and you don't refer to them when you use the term. If you did look it up, you would find a definition that includes things that aren't furniture and sometimes excludes things that are furniture. That's because it's an imperfect framework that we impose on conceptual categories that frequently distorts things, and religion is one of the concepts that is wildly distorted by trying to define it.
What language do you think the Torah was originally written in?
Hey everybody, this poster is going to go on to argue that the Torah was not written in Hebrew but in Phoenician, and that Hebrew didn't even exist until the 1st or 2nd century BCE, and what they're doing is conflating language and script. These are two very different things. To give you a modern example, you can write in English, you can write in German, you can write in Turkish, you can write in Maltese, you can write in Italian, all using the Latin script or a variation on the Latin script. Similarly, all the languages she mentions in the video, as well as Hebrew for the first several years of its existence, were based on the Phoenician script. What happened in the 2nd century BCE was that it transitioned to using the Aramaic script, which itself was a variation on the Phoenician script. So not a difference in language, difference in script, and it helps to be aware of that distinction.
Everybody, I just ran across this video I wanted to comment on. It makes two claims about biblical Hebrew from Genesis 1:1. One is based on real scholarship, but he overplays the influence of that scholarship, and the other is not based on any legitimate principles of biblical Hebrew etymology. He doesn't like the translation of Genesis 1:1. I don't either, but for completely different reasons. And what he asserts is that most scholars realize that bara means to separate or distinguish, not to create. And that's based on a paper from Ellen Van Wold a little over a decade ago, arguing from a cognitive linguistic point of view for this meaning. Now, that was a great paper. There was a great discussion that resulted from that. However, she is in the overwhelming minority view. Most scholars disagree with her. His other claim that Shemaim means something about non-existence or non-being, he breaks down the etymology in another video, but it's not based on any real principles of biblical Hebrew etymology. So,
Getting a lot of ignorance in my comments again, so I figured I'd just clear a couple of things up.
This is an extremely problematic video. To begin with, dead languages have no native speakers, period. Extinct languages have no speakers of any kind. Historical linguistics is for any language that changes over time, living or dead, and linguistic anthropology is primarily for living languages and learning how language influences society and vice versa. Semitic languages have never really been considered part of the Indo-European group. There have just been scholars who have been trying unsuccessfully for centuries to make that connection. If it exists at all, it's at a very, very high level. I don't know what the fixation on Greenberg and Zionism is all about. His grandfather didn't even have the name Greenberg. It was Zaito until Greenberg's father changed it after he immigrated from Poland. And the fact that white supremacists like Proto-Indo-European scholarship does not mean that scholars of PIE are white supremacists. Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to talk briefly about why I don't like the way that Genesis 1:1 tends to be translated in modern translations of the Bible. The first three words of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit bara Elohim, are generally translated "in the beginning God created." But that first word, Bereshit, shouldn't be translated "in the beginning" because there's no definite article there. And everywhere else that we find that phrase, it is in a construct relationship with some kind of temporal clause. So it's interpreted as when something began. And the vowels are the exact same in Genesis 1:1, and that's most likely how we're supposed to interpret it. In other words, it should be when God began to create. There is no absolute beginning reference in Genesis 1:1. That is just something that serves certain theological power structures to talk about creation ex nihilo.
Mass shootings stopped by armed civilians in the United States in the last 3 decades is...
Hey everybody, I wanted to comment on this video because it does overlap with some things that I've researched on the relationship of religion to gun violence, gun rhetoric, gun rights, the history of guns in America. It's not true that armed civilians have stopped zero mass shooters in the last 30 years. They do stop mass shooters and active shooters sometimes. However, they are less likely to stop an active shooter than an unarmed civilian, and far less likely to stop it than law enforcement. So that's one side of the rhetoric. We have to be careful about not misrepresenting the data. On the other side, you have some people in this person's comments talking about 2.5 million defensive gun uses a year, which is based on a repeatedly debunked article from the 90s by Kleck and Gertz, which is, nonsense in the other direction.
The Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform.
Hey everybody, this video is factually incorrect in every one of the points that it makes, but I want to focus on the audio that you just heard, which first off treats the Bible univocally, which is nonsense because the Bible is a collection of a wide variety of complex and often competing rhetorical goals. Next, it puts the cart firmly before the horse and ignores a bunch of parts of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures that insist that you don't get the redemption until you get the social reform. Clearest example of that is Hosea 6:6, that is quoted by Jesus in the book of Matthew twice. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. This is condemning the people who focused on their performance of religious duties to the detriment of the plight of the poor and the oppressed. And they repeatedly said, you have to treat the one problem before you can achieve the redemption. It's hypocrisy to do it the other way around. Hey, thanks for the question. I don't think it's loaded at all. I think it's a perfectly valid question. I'm not an atheist. I lived for the first 20 years of my life as kind of an agnostic. I just wasn't raised with religion. But I did join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm an active member of that church. In fact, I am employed as a scripture translation supervisor for that church right now. So I sympathize with the different perspectives related to religion, and I try to keep that in mind whenever I'm engaging scholarship. Regarding your other question, it's usually a good idea for scholars to acknowledge their biases, the perspectives that they come from. It's usually a bad idea to attack those biases, those perspectives as invalid in and of themselves in scholarship, but that's not really common among scholars. We tend to be pretty good about that kind of thing. Hey everybody, 4 quick facts about the Hebrew word Elohim from an expert. 1, Elohim is the plural form of the singular term El, which means deity, and that's as far as we can go etymologically. No indication it has any relationship to the word for mighty. 2, Elohim is grammatically plural, but is frequently used to refer to a singular entity, and there's nothing special or unique about that usage. It happens all over Northwest Semitic languages with all kinds of words. 3, Elohim does not mean judges. It means deity or deities. If a writer uses that term in reference to a human, they are calling that human a deity, which is not an ontological label, but one with reference to roles and relationships. 4, you cannot define deity or Elohim. It can't be reduced to necessary and sufficient features because it's not how the category was formed or used. There is only one thing that is shared by every single entity labeled Elohim, and that is that that entity has been labeled Elohim.
What is a fact or statistic that seems fake but is real?
Words and texts have no inherent meaning whatsoever. What you read on a page, there's no meaning that somehow travels through your eyes into your mind. What they are squiggles that have relationships that have been agreed upon to sounds, and combinations of sounds have relationships that have been agreed upon to semantic content. And so the process of reading is our minds recalling those relationships as we understand them and constructing the meaning in our minds. So when we approach old texts like the Bible, in the United States, things like the Constitution, what we're doing is reconstructing the meaning based on our best guess regarding how they understood the relationships. And that's if we care at all about how they understood the relationships. Frequently, all we care about is how we understand the relationships and what it means to us. Hey everybody, a little bit on the King James Version of the Bible. It is not technically a translation, but a revision of a 1602 edition of the Bishop's Bible. Itself a revision of an earlier Bible, which was a revision of an earlier Bible, going back to Tyndale's translation of the New Testament and his translation of the Old Testament up through Chronicles, and then the book of Jonah, as well as the other books of the Old Testament, completed by Miles Coverdale, who actually went to German translations and some Latin in order to fill in the gaps. King James translators basically wrote the changes into the margins of copies of the Bishop's Bible, and they consulted a bunch of different manuscripts, but the primary New Testament source text was a variety of versions of the Textus Receptus, which was originally based on a small number of very late Greek New Testament manuscripts that had a lot of differences from what we now understand to be the earliest text of the New Testament. Hey everybody, I wanted to take 60 seconds to talk about how there's just no such thing as biblical literalism. It does not exist. Every faith group that has ever approached the biblical text has done so with a set of rhetorical goals and with a set of expectations drawn from their understanding of their own sacred past. And reading the text is a process of negotiating with the text in light of those rhetorical goals. And while that sometimes involves asserting literal approaches to certain texts, it inevitably also involves rejecting literal approaches to other texts, because the priority in all of this is the needs and goals of the faith community. The Bible is not the priority. The Bible is secondary. It is this authority to which the group appeals for their beliefs. It is not the source of their beliefs. So there's just no such thing as a biblical literalist. They're ideological literalists, and they appeal to the Bible for their authority, but they did not get their beliefs from the Bible.
Is religion biologically hardwired into humans?
Hey everybody, I highly recommend checking out the rest of that video. I think Andrew does a great job of summarizing one of the consensus views within the cognitive science of religion. Now, the specific theory he's talking about, the hyperactive agency detection device, comes from Justin Barrett. It's slightly outdated and relies a bit on the theory of cognitive modularity, the idea that our brains have areas that are specialized to perform one function. And I'm a bit more of a cognitive generalist, the notion that functions are kind of spread all over the brain and not localized and compartmentalized. But the notion that deity concepts and concepts of the afterlife and spirits and ghosts
develop from our hypersensitivity to agency. Absolutely still the consensus view, even as the theory is getting more mature and complex. So check it out.
Challenge anybody to find one piece of information in the Bible that you can prove to be false.
Buckle up, Adam. This one's
I appreciate this poster's combating inerrancy, but he's going about it all wrong.
Talk about how a single alteration of that verse is one of the biggest reasons.
This variant has nothing to do with the roots of Christ's identification with God.
So focus on this one part. Who was manifest in flesh? Letters for who are Omicron and Zeta.
That's a sigma, that's not a zeta. Also, he dates the variant to the medieval period. It's actually Byzantine, it's much earlier. Now, he's going to write a different kind of sigma that was used in those manuscripts. In the Byzantine period, the sigma looked like a capital C, so these two words would have been virtually identical. That little line was the only difference. So this variant is probably accidental, not intentional.
This is called an anti-adoptionist change.
Adoptionism is promoted in Mark. That's really the strongest place we find it. Other Gospels use different frameworks, and the identification of Jesus with God has roots that go back to the identification of the angel of the Lord with God.
This is not at all Jesus claiming to be equal with God, much less claiming to be God himself.
Hey everybody, I wanted to comment on this related video to the previous one I did. This individual says that Jesus claiming to be able to forgive sins is just a parallel with priests forgiving sins, but that has nothing to do with ancient Israelite or Jewish ideology. The priest was not the one who had the agency to forgive sins. They simply facilitated the actions. It was God who was thought to forgive sins. But the parallel with Jesus is actually from Exodus 23, where God tells the Israelites that he's going to send an angel before him and to not disobey that angel because he had the authority not to forgive their sins because his name was in him. And this is where we get the indwelling of the name, and this is where we get the identification of Jesus with God based on the parallel of the messenger of the Lord constantly being identified as God, as in Exodus 3. Everybody, let's talk about how Jesus became identified with God. This goes all the way back to the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible, who is frequently identified with God himself, but that's originally the result of textual interpolation. Later, however, some writers decide to try to accommodate it to their theology, and we get in Exodus 23 this idea that the angel can exercise divine prerogatives as a result of having the divine name in him. Greco-Roman period pseudepigraphic literature elaborates on this concept with the figure of the Son of Man in Ancient of Days from Daniel 7, and we get this idea of a mediatory figure who possesses God's name and exercises God's authority. Christianity picks up on this, and so you have Jesus using the phrase, particularly in the Gospel of John, ego eimi, which is the ancient Greek translation of echia asher echia from Exodus 3, God's self-identification. And what Christianity is doing is saying Jesus possesses the divine name, can therefore exercise divine prerogatives and identify in some hazy way with God. The Trinity is a philosophical rationalization of this from the 3rd and 4th century.
Promised you guys we'd talk about how Adam in Genesis is a god, and I don't know if I'm going to fit all of this.
Okay, pretty much all the information in this video is wildly off base. This has nothing to do with any Sumerian creation account. In fact, she's actually addressing the details from a much later Babylonian creation account. The etymology is also all wrong, and it absolutely is a reference to Yahweh. It's the later of the two creation accounts written during the Babylonian exile. However, there are two things that she said. One, that they wanted to make an idol. There is a sense in which the creation account is a way to say, humanity, you all are God's divine image, therefore do not worship other divine images. Also, the comment about Adam being God. Adam was not a god. However, the point of driving them out of the Garden of Eden was to prevent them from gaining both of the two prototypical features of deity. The first is knowledge of good and evil, which is a merism for all knowledge, and the second is immortality. If they had those two things, as the serpent said, they would have been deities. Everybody, quick Bible fact for you, and that is that leprosy, better known today as Hansen's disease, does not appear a single time in the Bible. If your English translation has it, it's wrong. And here's why. The Hebrew term sara'at and the Greek term lepra actually refer to a variety of skin diseases that are quite a bit more benign, less communicable, and able to be healed. Vitiligo is an example of a disease that probably belongs in this group. And this is more about ritual impurity in the Bible than about something that's going to harm people. But what happened in the Renaissance period, there were a bunch of classical texts that had been preserved in Arabic translation that were translated back into Greek and Latin. And the Greek term lepra was accidentally used to translate references to Hansen's disease. And from that use of lepra, we get the term leprosy. And so it's a mistranslation. It has nothing to do with leprosy when you see it in the Bible. And the concern is ritual impurity, not harm to others. Hey everybody, I see claims like this pop up every now and then, usually around Christmas or Easter. 100% false, entirely made up. Hey, thanks for the comment. I am happy to do what I can to elaborate. Unfortunately, there's not a ton to this. These claims have proliferated in recent years, but they come from a 19th century book called The Natural Genesis, written by a guy named Gerald Massey. Now, he was an English poet and a spiritualist, and he liked ancient Egypt, like a lot of people did back then. And he argued that Western religions are all rooted in Egyptian religion. And he uses a lot of very strained and sometimes just nonsensical etymological arguments. And most of the stuff he's talking about has no basis in any Egyptian text. The only thing I can find that has any legitimacy at all is probably his connection to this tradition of the dying and rising God, which is a framework that isn't used anymore. It's pretty outdated. There's no good case for compartmentalizing it, but it has reference to these traditions of deities descending to the underworld and then coming back, usually in the spring, to explain the cycle of seasons and how life returns every year. So, hey everybody, cool story from 2 Kings 3. This whole chapter is about an Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition that set out to punish Moab for trying to throw off Israelite vassalage after the death of the king Ahab. Before they head out, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, says we need Yahweh's blessing on this. So they visit Elisha the prophet, who tells them Yahweh will deliver the Moabites into your hands. Along the way, they're destroying one city after another, and they get to the city where the king of Moab is holed up. They're about to take the city, and then the king of Moab offers his firstborn son as a sacrifice on the wall. And the text in verse 27 says there was Ketzef Gadol, great fury against Israel, and the troops pack up and head home. Ketzef Gadol refers to divine fury. There's only one way to read this text. Sacrifice worked. The Moabite deity Chemosh defeated Yahweh, drove off the Israelite forces, and the author of 2 Kings had to acknowledge it.
Great question. Let's talk about it. First, I highly recommend this book on this topic.
Hey everybody, I thought I'd comment on this video. Like so many videos, it's mixing good information with bad. First, the bad. They are telescoping a lot of texts that occur across about a millennia of time in order to try and treat it as if it was stolen wholesale. But these are fragments from very different ideological, rhetorical, sociocultural, material contexts that are saying many different things, and trying to fit it all into a single narrative that was just stolen is pejorative nonsense. The Ugaritic civilization was destroyed centuries before Hebrew ever existed as a language. So more likely, they're borrowing from a shared sociocultural matrix. Now, the good. Yes, many deities in early Israelite worship and ideology. Asherah was the consort of Yahweh. Deuteronomy 32:8 is understood by many scholars, myself included, to distinguish El Elyon from Yahweh. Hey everybody, this is part one to an introduction to dual process cognition, a central principle in the cognitive science of religion. It is a theoretical model that holds that our minds operate along a continuum that runs from what we call intuitive cognition, that is rapid, automatic, subconscious, and based on our mind's default settings, all the way to what we call reflective cognition, which is slower, deliberate, and based on things like reason and logic. And why is this important? It's because all of the input that we receive, all the data, all our senses, all our cognition passes through the intuitive to get to the reflective, meaning it mediates all that data for us and tells us how to structure it. And here's one quick illustration of that. This is called the corn sweet effect. Pause the video if you want. This looks like two different shades of gray, but this is actually the exact same shade of gray. It is intentionally designed to fool our intuitive reasoning and into thinking that it's two different shades of gray. Why that's important in the next video.
Okay, part 2. Our intuitive cognition mediates all of our cognition about ourselves and the world around us. But what does our reflective cognition do with it? There are two main things it does. One is called decoupling. That is where our reflective cognition kicks in to override or overrule an intuitive impulse. An easy example of this would be seeing a scary movie, going to bed, being woken up by a strange noise. At first we're freaked out, and then our reflective cognition comes in and says, oh, that must be the house settling, that must be the air conditioning kicking on. The other thing that we can do is called rationalization. And that's where our reflective cognition comes in to defend or rationalize an intuitive impulse, help us explain why it's there. This is very common in identity politics. Frequently we have an intuitive aversion to people who are the ideological other. And a lot of the arguing that goes on is really our reflective cognition trying to come up with reasons why. Part 3, what that has to do with religion. Okay, part 3, let's start to bring it around to religion. Evolution and universal aspects of the human experience have embedded a couple things deep in our intuitive cognition. One is a hair trigger to the presence of agency in the world around us. We are very quick to assume that an agent is responsible for events and phenomena that we don't understand. The other is what I call body agency partability. And this can get very complex. It arises in infancy, but the idea is basically that a mental agent does not require a physical body. So what that means is we live in a world that is potentially teeming with unseen agents like ghosts and spirits and deceased kin and things like that that can influence us and that have access to knowledge we don't have. Now, for societies or individuals that lean into the intuitive side of things, that's going to result in a lot of reflective rationalization about those agents, who they are, what they want, what they can do for us. And that's going to lead to the next part. Hey everybody, wanted to briefly talk about Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, two passages that I think are among the coolest in the whole Hebrew Bible. Now, verse 8 ends that El Elyon, God Most High, set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. That's the Masoretic text. The ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, has angels of God, and scholars know that they like to render that where they find B'nai Elohim in their source text, sons of God. So they postulated that that may have been in their source text. We later found a Dead Sea Scroll fragment that shows exactly that reading. So that was probably original, which would mean it says, El Elyon, God Most High, set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of God. And Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So many scholars, myself included, think this is a very, very ancient memory that is preserved in the Song of Moses from a time period when El Elyon was distinct from and the father of Yahweh. Hey everybody, want to give a brief explanation of what's going on in John 10, 34 through 36. So that is where Jesus quotes Psalm 82 in response to being accused of blasphemy. And in order to understand that, we got to understand how early Jewish folks understood Psalm 82. And they understood it in reference to the reception of the law at Sinai. That was kind of the narratival filter lens they looked at it through. And they understood the reception of the law basically to have divinized the Israelites, to make them immortal. But upon sinning with the golden calf, they're then reconsigned to mortality. So that is the trial scene in Psalm 82 that's going on. So what Jesus is doing is saying, you're getting upset with me for saying my Father and I are one, that I am divine. But if the Word of God, by its reception, can make people divine, how much more divine is that very Word itself, sanctified and sent into the world? Obviously, Jesus.
Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel.
Hey everybody, two critical problems with these rather naive polemics. The first is methodological, and that's the assumption of univocality, which is something they actually adopt from apologetics for rhetorical purposes. And that's the assumption that the Bible has a voice as a whole and that it has a singular voice, and is frequently manifested in the notion that the Bible's actual message can be found in merging variant accounts. In reality, what we have are different messages by different authors who have different rhetorical goals that you have to parse apart. The other problem is that the word ha-satan, or satan in Hebrew, is just a generic noun. It means adversary. It's like a prosecuting attorney. It's used to refer to humans all the time. can be used to refer to God, the angel of the Lord. It's very rarely used as a title for the devil, and most scholars don't think that's the case here. Okay, part 4 of my series on the cognitive science of religion. So we have a bunch of individuals running around with all kinds of concepts of deities and other unseen agents floating around, and we're talking about them, and we're creating material media to represent them, and we're interacting with them in different ways. And what happens is powerful social institutions begin to use those interactions as a means of what's called costly signaling, of showing other people in your social group that you're committed to its success and you're committed to its values and mores. And as those get embedded as credibility enhancing displays, they help those societies become more pro-social. That is, they increase social cohesion and the ability of the society to grow in size. And then you start to get organizations that are focused on these agents and interactions with them, which is the contemporary understanding of what it means to be a religion.
Mormons would rather maintain the church's reputation in their mind than to tend to the emotion.
Hey, I want to interact with this video because I think it raises some interesting dynamics associated with identity politics and with membership in religious institutions. But I'm going to add another step to the reasoning. It's not so much protecting the reputation of the church in the person's mind as it is protecting the person's own self-image. The church is really a reflective proxy for an intuitive aversion to having central social identities be critiqued. They're going to feel like critiques of us and attacks on us, and they're going to be rationalized in different ways. And I think if we can understand these intuitive dynamics associated with identity politics, then both sides can better engage this discussion. The discourse can get at the real issues rather than hacking away at the leaves of the problem that are really just a proxy. And at the same time, maybe Mormons can get better at understanding they're not being attacked personally.
It was voluntary means of working off debt or keeping captives from mustering a rebellion.
Hey everybody, this is not historical context. This is very, very bad apologetics. The only statement on that entire slide that is not flatly false is the fact that slavery in the Hebrew Bible was not race-based, and that's because the concept of race did not exist. Everything else is false. Involuntary slavery was not only to prevent rebellion. Most of the slaves were women and children. The slave trade was not prohibited. It is explicitly endorsed in Leviticus 25. The slave was not equal to everybody else in the community. They were explicitly property, and they were valued less than an Israelite. In fact, if somebody accidentally killed their slave, they were not punished at all because they lost their property, and that was considered punishment enough. So this is just bad apologetics. Hey everybody, I'm going to do some multi-part videos where I'm going to put my cognitive linguist hat back on and talk a little bit about definitions and how they are a tool for structuring power. And I'm going to use racism as an illustration of this. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about what definition is. When we define a category, a conceptual category, what we do is we look at all the members of the category. We try to find out what features they all share that distinguish them from other categories. We call these necessary and sufficient features. Necessary for inclusion, sufficient for distinction from all other categories. We do this with words as well. We look at the usage of words and we see what are people using these words to mean. We gather up all the examples and then, like I said, try to reduce it down to necessary and sufficient features. So that is the conceptual framework of definition. That is what is superimposed on usage in order to try to define things. Okay, part 2, why that's not always good. Okay, part 2. So we've got this conceptual framework that we are applying to different concepts and conceptual categories in order to basically delineate them. Say these are the boundaries of the category. Now, the main reason that this is distorting is that that framework has nothing to do with how categories form, how they're learned, or how they're used. So it is an artificial delineation. And so the question is, does that delineation actually follow usage, or is it taking something from outside of usage to arbitrarily
impose boundaries. And okay, I've used this example before, but furniture is a word that very few, if any, English speakers have ever had to look up in a dictionary to say, oh, that's what furniture means, because we don't learn it based on those features. We learn it based on seeing it being used and knowing what is being used in reference to. Okay, part 3, that conceptual framework does not adequately follow usage because what it does is imposes boundaries, but usage is actually focused internally on the prototypes of a conceptual category. So this is a theory that's called prototype theory. The idea is basically that through our lifetime we have experience seeing conceptual categories being used, and we develop intuitively an understanding of the prototypes of those categories. And category membership is based on the intuitive perception of some manner of similarity to that prototype, or what they call cognitive exemplars. And that can be a functional similarity, it can be an essential similarity, it can be a wide variety of things. But intuitively, we do not distinguish categories based on boundaries. We distinguish based on the prototypes. The boundaries are actually not inherent or natural to the category. They form only when they run into others and we find a rhetorical need to establish some boundaries. And in those situations, it's usually pretty arbitrary. Okay, part 4, why delineation of categories is arbitrary. And I'm going to use fruit as an example. According to prototype theory, category membership is graded. That means you can have better members of a category and poorer members of a category. And fruit is a wonderful example because we all think of apples and oranges and bananas and things like that as great examples of fruit. However, olives, figs, tomatoes, consistently ranked as poorer members of the category. They occupy the periphery of the category where their membership is even debated. The Supreme Court, for tax purposes a long time ago, said that tomatoes were a vegetable. And you know why? Because you did not eat them for dessert. That was the necessary and sufficient feature of fruit that they wanted. And this is because those necessary and sufficient features are based on perception and based on rhetorical need. They are not based on the features that actually produce the intuitive prototypes. Okay, part 5. What does this have to do with racism? If we look at debates about the meaning of racism, we see two broad definitions of the term. One is that it is just the generic belief in the superiority or inferiority of a given race, pretty generic. The other is that it is that belief, however, backed up with systemic or social power. And it's that last feature that really sits at the crux of this. There is a sense in which both definitions are right because there are people who use the term in each of those ways. So in a sense, it does get at usage. There is also a sense in which it is wrong because it is excluding usage in order to draw that boundary. And so the question becomes, what use is the definition? And in the next video, I'm going to explain exactly how we use them to structure power and values to serve our own interests. Okay, part 6, what's at stake with these definitions? In short, if racism is racial prejudice in any direction, then you can be racist against white people, which is rhetorically useful for white folks because, hey, you're being racist against me is a very powerful accusation that can be used to shut down arguments and also to vilify and problematize the initiatives that minorities are using to try to dismantle white supremacy. If systemic power is necessary, it means you cannot be racist against white people, at least not in contemporary Western societies where we exercise the overwhelming majority of systemic power. Now, if you look in most dictionaries today, you're going to find the broader definition because they're trying to be inclusive of all the usage. However, that's not the only question to ask. Why are the other definitions being used? Obviously, white folks are going to appeal to one more than another because it's helpful for their structuring of power. But is one usage more right than the other? That's next. Okay, part 7. If we look at the history of the use of the term racism, the usage prior to the civil rights movement unilaterally involves systemic power. It is always used in reference to
powerful people against less powerful people. It's coined in the early 19th century in reference to the U.S. government's poor treatment of First Nations people, of Native Americans. In the early 20th century, when it was used in reference to the fascist movements, the Nazi movements. The term racialism was more common during this time period, but they were more or less synonymous. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement that white people came up with the phrase reverse racism as a way to undercut the accusations of black folks. But the term reverse in that phrase makes clear they understood racism to go in a specific direction. And so prior to the Civil Rights Movement, the systemic power definition was definitely more common. Okay, conclusion. What has happened since then? Reverse racism didn't go very well. It was pretty self-defeating to acknowledge that racism went in a specific direction, because if it did, it meant reverse racism wasn't really a thing. So since then, white folks have appealed more commonly to the more generic dictionary definitions. There are some definitions that talk about social power in the 60s and 70s and things like that, but these days they tend to be more generic, and that is very useful for white folks, precisely because it structures power in their favor. However, if you are using your systemic power to structure power in your favor and against the interests of minorities, well, that's racism. So in these discussions about the definition of racism, try to figure out why people are defining it the way they are. Are they doing it for racist purposes or not? Hey everybody, wanted to talk briefly about the title Son of Man. We know it from the Hebrew Bible, particularly Ezekiel, as a reference to humanity. In the New Testament, it is used exclusively as a messianic title for Christ. And in the book of Revelation, that title is actually conflated with features of the Ancient of Days. So somewhere along the way, it became a reference to a divine figure. And what happened? Well, it goes back to Daniel 7:13. That's where we get the tradition of the one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven and coming to the Ancient of Days. But the earliest Greek translation we know of this text says something a little different. It actually says the Son of Man came as the Ancient of Days. And it seems that a tradition developed within Greco-Roman period Judaism of a messianic divine mediator figure who was known as both Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. And that tradition is taken up in the New Testament as a way to identify Christ as this mediatory figure.